You felt it before. That inexplicable fatigue after certain interactions, the subtle draining of your life force when particular people enter your orbit. You've learned to identify them, the complainers, the narcissists, the perpetual victims, those we commonly label as energy vampires. But what if the most dangerous energy vampire in your life isn't someone else? What if, in the shadows of your unconscious mind, it's actually you? What if the very behaviors you despise in others are manifesting through you in ways invisible to your conscious awareness? This revelation might be the most uncomfortable truth you'll face today, and possibly the most liberating. If something inside you just flinched at that suggestion, hit subscribe. This channel explores the truths others are afraid to say, and more importantly, the truths we're afraid to admit to ourselves. Carl Jung once wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This profound insight points to a psychological mechanism that most of us spend our lives avoiding: our own shadow self. The parts of us that drain others aren't usually the parts we proudly display to the world. They're the unhealed wounds, the unintegrated aspects, and the unconscious patterns that operate beneath our awareness. Today, we're embarking on a journey into the mirror, a journey of radical self-accountability. We'll examine how the unacknowledged aspects of ourselves can silently transform us into the very energy vampires we try to avoid. This isn't about shame or self-criticism. It's about liberation through awareness, because when we recognize how we unconsciously deplete others, we gain the power to transform those patterns and create genuinely nourishing connections. Drawing from Jungian psychology, emotional intelligence frameworks, and the practice of radical self-accountability, we'll explore 6 ways you might be functioning as an energy vampire without realizing it. The goal isn't to make you feel guilty, but to illuminate what has remained in darkness, because what remains unconscious continues to control us, while what becomes conscious can be transformed. Chapter 1. The Unconscious Complainer. Draining through negativity. The first energy vampire we harbor within is the unconscious complainer. This aspect of ourselves sees the world through a lens of negativity and scarcity rather than abundance and possibility. While we easily recognize chronic complainers around us, those who drain rooms with their perpetual dissatisfaction, we often fail to notice when we've slipped into the same pattern. The unconscious complainer operates through what Jung would call a negative animus or negative anima, an internal voice that constantly criticizes, finds fault, and focuses on what's wrong rather than what's right. This voice doesn't present itself as complaining in our minds. It disguises itself as being realistic or having high standards. Consider how often your conversations revolve around what's broken, disappointing, or frustrating. Do you find yourself regularly discussing problems without moving toward solutions? Do your friends or partners seem mysteriously tired after your seemingly innocent venting sessions? The energy of complaint creates a downward spiral that doesn't just deplete you, it depletes everyone in your orbit. Neurologically, complaint reinforces negative neural pathways. Each time we complain, we strengthen the brain's tendency to find more things to complain about. It becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. Research from Stanford University suggests that just 30 minutes of complaining actually damages the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for problem solving. We literally reduce our capacity to find solutions the more we focus on problems. The unconscious complainer doesn't recognize the energetic bill they're handing to others. Every complaint is essentially asking for emotional labor, asking others to carry your dissatisfaction, validate your negativity, or solve your problems. Over time, people begin to experience an energetic deficit around chronic complainers, feeling subtly drained without knowing exactly why. The path to transformation begins with awareness. Start by conducting a simple audit of your speech patterns for a single day. How often do your statements focus on what's wrong versus what's right? How frequently do you express dissatisfaction versus appreciation? This isn't about toxic positivity or denying legitimate concerns. It's about recognizing the energetic impact of a complaint-dominant communication style. Jung believed that integration, rather than suppression, was the key to psychological health. The solution isn't to silence your dissatisfaction, but to transform how you process and express it. Ask yourself, am I seeking solutions or simply venting? Am I taking responsibility for my experience or blaming external circumstances? Am I communicating in a way that energizes or depletes? When you catch yourself in the complaining pattern, pause and redirect toward either constructive problem-solving or genuine appreciation. This simple practice begins to retrain not just your speech patterns, but your perception itself. Chapter 2. The emotional black hole, draining through unprocessed trauma. The second inner energy vampire manifests as an emotional black hole. The unprocessed trauma and emotional wounds that unconsciously pull others into your healing process without consent or boundaries. Jung recognized that unintegrated emotional wounds create what he called complexes, emotionally charged clusters of thoughts and feelings that operate autonomously within the psyche. These complexes don't announce themselves. They hijack our behavior in subtle ways, particularly in our closest relationships. When we haven't properly processed our emotional wounds, whether from childhood neglect, past relationship betrayals, or accumulated disappointments, we often unconsciously seek healing through our current relationships. This creates an invisible energetic vacuum that pulls others into caretaking roles they never agreed to. The process happens beneath conscious awareness. You might believe you're simply sharing your struggles or seeking connection, but the underlying dynamic involves transferring your emotional burden onto others. Partners, friends, and even colleagues find themselves inexplicably exhausted after interactions, having unconsciously absorbed your unprocessed feelings. Common signs that you might be functioning as an emotional black hole include relationships that follow a pattern of initial intensity, followed by the other person withdrawing. Finding that friends or partners often tell you they feel overwhelmed or need space. Experiencing a sense of emotional abandonment when others maintain healthy boundaries. Noticing that conversations consistently turn toward your emotional needs. Feeling an insatiable hunger for reassurance and validation. The emotional black hole operates through what therapists call emotional leakage, the unconscious transmission of unprocessed feelings to others. This isn't simply sharing emotions, which can be healthy and connecting. It's the unconscious offloading of emotional responsibility. Psychologists identify this pattern as a form of emotional fusion, where boundaries between self and other become blurred. When we haven't learned to self-regulate our emotional states, we unconsciously recruit others to do this work for us. The result is relationships that become imbalanced and eventually unsustainable. The path toward transformation requires developing what emotional intelligence researchers call emotional self-sufficiency, the capacity to hold, process, and regulate your own emotional states without immediately externalizing them onto others. This doesn't mean isolation or suppression. It means developing an internal container strong enough to hold your feelings while you process them consciously. Practices that strengthen this container include journal writing that explores emotions before sharing them with others, developing a meditation practice focused on emotional awareness, working with a therapist to process deeper wounds, learning to distinguish between sharing for connection versus sharing for relief, practicing self-soothing techniques when emotional intensity arises. As Jung noted, your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. By developing the capacity to consciously work with your own emotional material, you transform from an unconscious energy drain into someone capable of genuine emotional exchange. Chapter 3. The Covert Controller. Draining through hidden power dynamics. The third energy vampire within us operates through subtle control mechanisms, the covert controller. This aspect doesn't dominate overtly, but depletes others through invisible strings of manipulation, expectation, and indirect influence. In Jungian terms, the covert controller emerges from our shadow's relationship to power. When we haven't integrated our natural desire for agency and influence, it emerges sideways, through passive-aggressive behaviors, subtle guilt trips, emotional withdrawal as punishment, or unstated expectations. The covert controller doesn't recognize itself as controlling. It believes it's simply trying to create safety, maintain standards, or protect relationships. But beneath these justifications lies an unconscious fear of vulnerability and a deep need to manage anxiety by controlling external circumstances and others' behaviors. This pattern is particularly insidious because it operates beneath the surface of awareness, both yours and others. People in your life may not be able to articulate exactly why they feel drained, constrained, or resentful. They simply experience a subtle pressure to conform to unspoken rules or manage your unstated emotional needs. Common manifestations of the covert controller include giving unsolicited advice disguised as concern, using subtle guilt as a motivator, whatever you think is best, while clearly communicating disappointment, withholding approval until others meet unstated expectations, creating dependencies through excessive helpfulness, using vulnerability strategically to elicit caretaking behaviors, making sacrifices that weren't requested, then resenting others for not appreciating them. These behaviors create what psychologists call a covert contract, an unspoken agreement where you expect certain responses without explicit negotiation. When others fail to fulfill their end of this invisible contract, you feel justified in your disappointment or resentment, not recognizing that they never consciously agreed to your terms. The energetic toll on others is substantial. People in relationship with a covert controller exist in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning for hidden expectations and unspoken rules. This vigilance depletes their cognitive and emotional resources, leaving them exhausted without understanding exactly why. Radical self-accountability requires examining your relationship with control itself. Ask yourself, where am I indirect about my needs and expectations? How often do I use implication rather than clear communication? In what ways do I attempt to manage others' perceptions of me? Where do I create dependencies that keep others orbiting around me? How do I respond when others set boundaries or make choices I wouldn't make? The transformation begins with developing what psychologists call clean communication, the practice of stating needs, expectations, and feelings directly while respecting others' autonomy. This includes making explicit requests rather than hinting, expressing disappointment directly rather than through withdrawal or passive aggression, distinguishing between observations and evaluations, taking responsibility for your own emotional reactions, recognizing and respecting others' boundaries as acts of health rather than rejection. As you develop cleaner communication patterns, you'll notice something surprising. Authentic influence actually increases when manipulative control decreases. When people feel genuinely free around you rather than managed, they're more likely to choose connection based on mutual respect rather than obligation or fear. Chapter 4. The Perpetual Victim, Draining Through Disowned Responsibility. Perhaps the most energy-depleting inner vampire is the perpetual victim, the aspect of ourselves that unconsciously avoids responsibility by positioning ourselves as helpless in the face of circumstances and others' behaviors. In Jungian psychology, this pattern relates to the disowned hero or sovereign archetypes, the aspects of self capable of decisive action and self-determination. When we haven't integrated these empowered aspects, we default to a victim orientation, experiencing life as something that happens to us rather than something we actively co-create. The perpetual victim doesn't recognize itself as such. It genuinely experiences helplessness and sees external circumstances or others' behaviors as the primary determinants of its experience. The underlying psychological mechanism involves what psychologists call external locus of control, the belief that forces outside yourself determine your outcomes and experiences. This mindset creates a particular form of energy vampirism, one that depletes others by unconsciously assigning them responsibility for your well-being, happiness, and life circumstances. Each complaint implicitly contains a request: fix this for me, because I cannot fix it myself. The most common manifestations of the perpetual victim include chronic explanations of why change isn't possible in your situation, stories that consistently position you as wrong by others or circumstances, a focus on barriers rather than possibilities, rejecting solutions while remaining attached to problems, seeking sympathy rather than growth, the subtle expectation that others should accommodate your limitations. When operating from this inner vampire, you unconsciously transmit helplessness to others. Friends, family, and colleagues find themselves carrying an invisible responsibility, not just for their own lives, but for yours as well. They leave interactions feeling weighted down by problems they can't solve and responsibilities that aren't rightfully theirs. The energetic mathematics is simple. Each time you position yourself as powerless, someone else must carry the power you've disowned. This creates an unconscious drain on their resources and ultimately damages relationships through imbalance and resentment. Transformation begins with what psychotherapists call responsibility, the recognition that while you didn't choose many of your circumstances, you always retain the ability to choose your response to them. This isn't about blame, but about reclaiming your inherent agency. Practical steps toward integration include monitoring your language for victimhood indicators. I have to, I can't, they make me feel. Replacing victimhood language with agency language. I choose to, I'm deciding not to, I feel. Asking empowering questions. What can I influence here? Rather than, why does this always happen to me? Practicing what psychologists call beneficial discomfort, the willingness to experience temporary discomfort for long-term growth. Developing greater tolerance for uncertainty and risk. As you integrate the disowned sovereign within, you'll discover something remarkable. Energy returns. The enormous resources previously spent maintaining victimhood become available for creative action. And rather than depleting others, you begin to energize them through your example of self-responsibility. Chapter 5. The Chronic Distractor, Draining Through Avoidance of Depth. The fifth energy vampire within us operates through perpetual busyness and distraction, the chronic distractor. This aspect of ourselves fears authentic presence and depth, instead creating a whirlwind of activity, small talk, and diversions that prevent genuine connection. Jung observed that modern humans often substitute intensity for meaning, creating lives filled with constant stimulation but devoid of depth. The chronic distractor is the embodiment of this substitute, using perpetual motion and surface-level engagement to avoid the vulnerability of authentic presence. This inner vampire doesn't experience itself as avoiding anything. It simply feels uncomfortable with silence, stillness, and emotional intimacy. It believes itself to be productive, social, or practical, not recognizing the deeper avoidance pattern operating beneath these justifications. The energetic drain this creates in relationships is subtle but profound. Authentic connection requires presence, the willingness to drop beneath the surface and engage with what's real. When we consistently divert conversations toward the superficial, interrupt moments of intimacy with distractions, or fill potential spaces of depth with busyness, we prevent the very connections our hearts most deeply desire. Common manifestations of the chronic distractor include filling conversational silences with nervous chatter, changing the subject when emotions arise, checking devices during intimate conversations, keeping discussions at the level of opinions rather than feelings, creating perpetual busyness that prevents deeper connection, using humor to deflect from emotional vulnerability. This pattern depletes others by requiring them to consistently push against your resistance to depth. Eventually, many simply stop trying, leading to relationships that feel inexplicably empty despite constant interaction. The psychological mechanism underlying this pattern relates to what attachment theorists call avoidant attachment, a strategy developed early in life to manage the vulnerability inherent in close connection. The chronic distractor has learned, often unconsciously, that emotional intimacy equals vulnerability, and vulnerability equals potential pain. Transforming this pattern begins with developing what mindfulness practitioners call present moment awareness, the capacity to remain fully engaged with what's happening now without escaping into distraction. This includes practicing deliberate pauses before responding in conversations, creating technology-free spaces for deeper connection, learning to tolerate the initial discomfort of emotional intimacy, noticing the impulse to distract and choosing to remain present, developing comfort with silence and its natural revelatory power. As Jung noted, in all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder a secret order. When you learn to sit with the initial discomfort of authentic presence, something remarkable emerges, the very connection your heart has always sought beneath the distractions. Chapter 6. The Ungrounded Idealist. Draining through disconnection from reality. The final energy vampire within us manifests as the ungrounded idealist, the aspect that dwells in perfectionism, impossible standards, and abstract ideals, disconnected from the messy reality of human experience. In Jungian terms, this pattern represents an inflation of the ideal at the expense of the real. When we haven't properly integrated our relationship with imperfection and limitation, we create an unconscious split where part of us lives in a world of how things should be, rather than engaging with how things actually are. The ungrounded idealist doesn't recognize itself as unrealistic. It genuinely believes its standards and expectations are reasonable, not seeing how they've become disconnected from the lived reality of human experience. This creates a particular form of energy vampirism, draining others through impossible expectations and subtle disappointment when reality fails to match the ideal. This inner vampire manifests in several common patterns: perfectionism that prevents completion or celebration, chronic disappointment with people and situations, black and white thinking that misses nuance and complexity, difficulty celebrating partial victories and incremental progress, setting standards for others that ignore human limitation, an underlying tone of disappointment with life itself. The energetic cost to those around you is substantial. People sense they can never quite measure up to your unspoken standards. They feel subtly judged, even when you don't explicitly criticize them. Over time, they experience the weight of your disappointed idealism as a burden they cannot relieve, no matter how hard they try. Psychologically, this pattern often emerges from what therapists call defensive idealization, a mechanism that protects us from the grief of accepting reality's limitations. By maintaining impossible standards, we avoid fully feeling the disappointment of life's inherent imperfection. The transformation requires developing what philosophers call tragic wisdom, the capacity to fully embrace reality with all its limitations while still working toward meaningful improvement. This integration involves distinguishing between healthy aspirations and perfectionistic demands, practicing radical acceptance of what is before attempting change, developing comfort with ambiguity and paradox, celebrating progress rather than fixating on the gap between real and ideal, embracing what Zen practitioners call beginner's mind, an approach to life characterized by curiosity rather than judgment. As you ground your idealism in the soil of reality, something unexpected happens. Your capacity for genuine positive influence actually increases. Rather than draining others through impossible standards, you begin to energize them through what psychologists call growth-fostering relationships. Connections characterized by realistic acceptance combined with gentle encouragement toward authentic development. As we reach the end of our exploration, we return to Jung's profound insight. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The energy vampires within us operate in shadow, not because they are evil, but because they remain unintegrated aspects of our wholeness. The journey of radical self-accountability isn't about self-criticism or shame, it's about illumination. It's about bringing compassionate awareness to the ways we unconsciously drain others so that we might transform these patterns into their higher expressions. The unconscious complainer can become the constructive communicator. The emotional black hole can become the emotional sovereign. The covert controller can become the clear collaborator. The perpetual victim can become the response-able creator. The chronic distractor can become the present connector. The ungrounded idealist can become the grounded visionary. This transformation doesn't happen through force or self-rejection. It happens through the alchemical power of conscious awareness. When we see these patterns clearly, their unconscious grip begins to loosen. We gain the freedom to choose different responses aligned with our deepest values rather than our unconscious wounds. Remember that this work isn't about achieving perfection. It's about embracing a journey of continuous integration. We will all slip into these patterns at times. The difference lies in how quickly we notice, how gently we correct course, and how deeply we commit to growth. As you move forward from this video, I invite you to approach yourself with compassion. Notice these patterns without judgment when they arise. Bring curiosity rather than criticism to your discoveries. And remember that your willingness to see yourself clearly is itself an act of courage and love, not just for yourself, but for everyone your life touches. If this exploration resonated with something deep within you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who might benefit from this perspective, and subscribe to continue walking deeper into the territory of the soul, where our greatest wounds and our greatest gifts often occupy the same sacred ground.